At dawn on May 3, 1945, a demolition crew assembled aboard the light cruiser Emden, where she lay grounded in the shallows of Heikendorfer Bucht outside Kiel. The ship listed 15 degrees to port. Her forward funnel had been destroyed by bombs. Her deck plating was twisted from near misses. Water lapped against hull plates that had been welded in 1923 when Germany was forbidden to build warships, and this vessel represented defiance of that prohibition. The crew placed explosive charges in key compartments: magazines, engine rooms, fuel bunkers. The charges were connected by detonation cord. At a signal, they would destroy the ship. 5 days remained until Germany's unconditional surrender. British forces were 20 kilometers away. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had succeeded Hitler as head of state on April 30th, was already negotiating surrender terms with Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. The war was over in everything but formality. Yet the crew of Emden prepared to scuttle their ship rather than allow her capture. This was not fanaticism. This was discipline. Orders required the destruction of all Kriegsmarine vessels to prevent Allied seizure. The orders would be obeyed. At approximately 0600 hours, the charges detonated. The explosions ripped through Emden's hull. The already damaged structure collapsed. The ship settled deeper into the mud. Fire and smoke marked her position. When the smoke cleared, Emden was a wreck, the last major Kriegsmarine surface unit to be scuttled. The final act in the story of a ship that had trained a generation of German naval officers and survived longer than almost every other warship built in the 1920s. The story of Emden began not with war but with humiliation. On June 28, 1919, Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles. Article 181 limited the German Navy to 6 battleships, 6 light cruisers, 12 destroyers, 12 torpedo boats. All vessels displacing over 10,000 tons were prohibited. No submarines were permitted. No aircraft carriers. The fleet that had challenged Britain at Jutland was to be scuttled at Scapa Flow or distributed to the victorious powers. Germany would be a third-rate naval power, incapable of threatening anyone. By 1921, the Reichsmarine operated exactly what the treaty permitted: 6 pre-dreadnought battleships, 6 obsolete cruisers from the Gazelle and Berlin classes, commissioned between 1899 and 1904, 12 destroyers, 12 torpedo boats. Every vessel was worn out. Every vessel had been scheduled for scrapping before the war. The newest cruiser was 20 years old. The oldest was nearly 30. Article 190 of the treaty specified that new warships could be built only to replace vessels that had served 20 years. In 1921, that meant Germany could order 1 replacement cruiser. Displacement was capped at 6,000 long tons. The Allied Naval Commission would inspect all designs and construction to ensure compliance. Any deviation would result in immediate sanctions. This was the environment in which Emden was conceived. She would be the first major warship built in Germany since 1918. She would validate that German industry retained the capability to design and construct modern warships. She would demonstrate that the Versailles restrictions could be navigated, and she would provide a training platform for officers and crew who would rebuild the German Navy when circumstances permitted. The design was conservative by necessity. The Reichsmarine wanted a modern cruiser with 8-inch guns, turbines capable of 30 knots, armor sufficient to resist 6-inch shells. The Allied Commission rejected everything. The guns would be 15-centimeter weapons, obsolete World War I stocks. They would be mounted in single turrets, not twin or triple mounts. Displacement would not exceed 6,000 tons. These restrictions ensured Emden would be inferior to every cruiser built by major naval powers. British, American, Japanese, French, and Italian cruisers displacing 10,000 tons with 8-inch guns would outrange, outgun, and outfight her. But she would exist. That was the point. The keel was laid on December 8, 1921 at Reichsmarinewerft in Wilhelmshaven. Construction proceeded slowly. Political instability in the Weimar Republic diverted resources. Hyperinflation destroyed the currency multiple times. Skilled shipyard workers were scarce because many had emigrated during the economic chaos. Material shortages delayed every phase. Steel was expensive. Components had to be fabricated domestically because foreign suppliers refused credit. The project became a test of whether Germany could build anything while under Allied supervision. The hull was launched on January 7, 1925. Admiral Hans Senker gave the commissioning speech. The widow of Karl von Mueller, christened the ship. Mueller had commanded the first Emden, a light cruiser that raided commerce in the Indian Ocean during World War I before being destroyed by HMAS Sydney in November 1914. The new Emden would carry that legacy. She would honor the tradition of the Kaiserliche Marine while representing the future of the Reichsmarine. The specifications reflected what could be achieved within treaty limits. Length 155.1 meters overall, beam 14.2 meters, draft 5.3 meters at standard displacement. Standard displacement 5,600 tons. Full load displacement 6,900 tons. This exceeded the treaty limit by 900 tons, but the Allied Commission retrospectively approved the excess after construction was too far advanced to change. 2 Brown Bovary-geared steam turbines drove 2 shafts, 4 coal-fired, marine-type water tube boilers, and 6 oil-fired, marine-type boilers generated 45,900 shaft horsepower. Design speed, 29.4 knots. In trials, Emden achieved 29.5 knots. Range was excellent, 5,700 nautical miles at 12 knots. This reflected the original mission concept. Long-range training cruises showing the flag at foreign ports. The main armament consisted of 8 15-centimeter SKL/45 guns in single mounts, 2 forward in superfiring arrangement, 2 amidships on each beam, 2 aft in superfiring arrangement. This configuration meant only 6 guns could fire broadside. 2 guns were always masked. British and American cruisers mounted 8 or 9 guns per broadside from twin or triple turrets. Emden's firepower was inferior by design. The treaty prohibited better arrangements. The guns fired 45.3 kilogram shells at 835 meters per second muzzle velocity. Maximum range 17,600 meters at 30-degree elevation. Rate of fire 5 to 7 rounds per minute. Total ammunition capacity 960 rounds, 120 per gun. These were World War I vintage weapons, designated C/09 or C/16 models, worn-out guns from the Kaiser's fleet, refurbished and mounted on Germany's newest cruiser. Secondary armament initially consisted of 3 8.8-centimeter SKL/45 anti-aircraft guns. A third was added later. These weapons had effective ceiling of 9,000 meters and fired 12-kilogram shells. 4 50-centimeter torpedo tubes were mounted amidships, later replaced by 533-millimeter tubes in 1934. Total torpedo capacity, 12 weapons. Mine carrying capacity was added in 1938, 120 mines. Protection was minimal. Belt armor, 50 millimeters over 70% of the hull length. Deck armor, 20 to 40 millimeters depending on location. Conning tower, 100 millimeters. Turret shields, 40 millimeters. This was adequate against destroyer-caliber weapons, but insufficient against cruiser fire. A 6-inch shell would penetrate anywhere. An 8-inch shell would pass through as if the armor didn't exist. Emden could not fight modern cruisers. She was designed for commerce raiding, shore bombardment, and training. Combat against equivalent opponents was not anticipated. Emden was commissioned on October 15, 1925. Her first commander was Korvettenkapitän. Her assignment was training ship for naval cadets. This would remain her primary role through 20 years of service. From 1926 to 1939, Emden circumnavigated the globe multiple times. She visited every continent except Antarctica. She conducted training cruises to South America, East Asia, Africa, Australia, North America. German naval cadets learned seamanship aboard Emden. They learned navigation in unfamiliar waters. They learned ship handling in foreign ports. They learned the traditions and expectations of the officer class. The cruise of 1926 through 1928 was typical. Departed Wilhelmshaven, November 19, 1926. Transited the Mediterranean, Suez Canal, Indian Ocean, Dutch East Indies. Reached Japan. Crossed the northern Pacific to Alaska. Proceeded down the west coast of North America, stopping at Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego. Continued to South America. Rounded Cape Horn. Visited Rio de Janeiro on Christmas Day, 1927. Crossed the Atlantic via the Azores. Arrived Wilhelmshaven March 14, 1928. 16 months at sea. 60,000 nautical miles steamed, 200 naval cadets trained. Later cruises were similarly extensive, 1928 through 1929. Mediterranean, Suez, Indian Ocean, Australia, Hawaii, Panama, Caribbean, home, 1931. Yangtze River, Shanghai, Nanking, showing the flag while Japanese forces occupied Manchuria, 1932 through 1933. Another circumnavigation. Each cruise trained new officers. Each cruise demonstrated German naval presence. Each cruise collected intelligence on foreign ports, naval forces, commercial shipping patterns that would be valuable if war came. Notable commanders included Lothar von Arnold de la Perrière, the most successful U-boat ace of World War I, credited with 453,716 tons of enemy shipping sunk. He commanded Emden from September 1928 to October 1930. Karl Dönitz, future commander of the U-boat force and Hitler's designated successor, commanded from September 1934 to September 1935. Every ambitious officer wanted command of Emden. Training ship duty was prestigious. Success as Emden's commander marked an officer for higher responsibility. In 1933, major modifications were undertaken. The 4 coal-fired boilers were replaced with oil-fired units. The funnels were shortened by approximately 2 meters. Wireless transmitter gaffs were installed on the aft funnel. The modifications improved efficiency and reduced smoke signature. The ship was out of service from April 1st to September 29th, 1933 while the work was completed. By September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Emden was 14 years old, obsolescent but serviceable. On September 4th, the 4th day of the war, British bombers attacked Wilhelmshaven. 5. Bristol Blenheim bombers attacked the harbor. German anti-aircraft fire shot down 4. The 5th, already fatally damaged, crashed directly into Emden's forecastle. The aircraft disintegrated on impact. The fuel ignited. The bombs detonated. 29 German sailors were killed or wounded. 4 British airmen died. The pilot was Flying Officer Henry Llewellyn Emden, killed while attacking a warship bearing his own surname. The coincidence was noted in British and German records. After repairs, Emden participated in mine-laying operations in the North Sea. In April 1940, she was assigned to Kriegsschiff Gruppe 5 for Operation Weserübung, the invasion of Norway. The task force included the heavy cruisers Blücher and Luetzow, 3 torpedo boats, 8 R-type minesweepers. Mission: seize Oslo. On the morning of April 9th, the force entered Oslofjord. Norwegian coastal defenses at Oscarsborg Fortress engaged. Blücher was hit by 280mm guns and torpedoes. She sank with over 1,000 casualties. Luetzow was damaged. The invasion force withdrew, landed troops further down the fjord, and eventually took Oslo from landward approach. Emden served as communications center coordinating Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine operations during the campaign. After Norway, Emden returned to training duties. Through 1941 and 1942, she operated in the Baltic, training new officers while the war consumed experienced personnel at accelerating rates. In September 1941, she supported German operations during Operation Barbarossa, providing gunfire support on the Swarb Peninsula. In November 1941, she was formally assigned to the training unit at Gotenhafen. She would remain in that role through most of the war. In June 1942, major armament upgrades were implemented. The 8 World War I 15-centimeter guns were replaced with TBTS KC-36 weapons designed for destroyers. These fired 40-kilogram shells at 875 meters per second, with maximum range 23,500 meters at 47-degree elevation. Rate of fire improved. Range increased, but the single-mount configuration remained. Firepower was still inferior to modern cruisers. 2 of the 4 torpedo tubes were removed. Anti-aircraft armament was augmented continuously. By 1944, Emden carried 3 10.5-centimeter guns, 9 3.7-centimeter guns, multiple 2-centimeter guns in single, twin, and quadruple mounts. The ship bristled with anti-aircraft weapons, but remained vulnerable to aerial attack because the weapons were manually aimed and fire control was primitive. Through 1943 and 1944, Emden trained officers for a navy that was dying. The surface fleet was bottled up in Norwegian fjords. The U-boat force was suffering unsustainable losses in the Atlantic. German naval aviation barely existed, yet the training continued because institutional momentum and discipline demanded it. New officers were needed. Emden provided them. The fact that many would die within months of commissioning was not discussed. In late 1944, Emden conducted mine-laying operations in the Skagerrak. On October 5th and 6th, she laid mines across convoy routes. The operations were largely futile. Allied shipping avoided areas where German mine-laying was suspected. The mines would sink a few vessels over the next months but would not affect the strategic situation. On November 9th, Emden attempted to assist the cruiser Köln, which had run aground. The operation failed. Köln was eventually scuttled. On December 9th, 1944, Emden herself ran aground in Oslofjord off Flataguri. She was refloated the following day, but the grounding damaged her already worn propulsion system. She proceeded to Königsberg for repairs at Schikauwerke shipyard. The repairs were incomplete when Soviet forces attacked Königsberg in late January 1945. On January 23, 1945, Emden received orders to evacuate. Operation Hannibal. The massive evacuation of German military forces and civilians from East Prussia was underway. Hundreds of thousands of people needed transport to Western Germany before Soviet forces cut them off. Every available ship was pressed into service. Emden, with her engines partially repaired and her guns hastily reinstalled, would carry refugees. But first, a special cargo. The remains of Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and his wife had been disinterred from their tomb in the Tannenberg Memorial to prevent capture by Soviet forces. Emden would transport them to safety. The cruiser, built to honor the legacy of the first Emden and to train officers for future wars, would carry the body of Germany's greatest World War I commander on her final operational voyage. Emden departed Königsberg under tow from icebreakers. The harbor was frozen. The ship's engines were functioning but unreliable. One propeller was inoperable. She reached Pillau and transferred Hindenburg's remains to the transport MS Pretoria. Then Emden continued west, limping on one propeller, engines vibrating excessively, steering erratically. She reached Kiel on February 6, 1945. Kiel was under continuous air attack. RAF Bombardier Command and the U.S. 8th Air Force struck the naval base repeatedly. The heavy cruisers Admiral Hipper and Admiral Scheer were in port. Numerous destroyers, minesweepers, U-boats crowded the harbor and shipyard facilities. All were targets. Emden entered Deutsche Werke shipyard for repairs that would never be completed. On March 11th, incendiary bombs set fires on Emden's forward deck and port torpedo launchers. Damage control parties extinguished the fires. On April 3rd, a direct hit destroyed the forward funnel. The structure collapsed across the deck. Casualties were light, but the damage was severe. On the night of April 9th through 10th, 359 RAF bombers attacked Kiel. Admiral Scheer took multiple direct hits and capsized. Admiral Hipper was hit and severely damaged. Emden suffered a near-miss astern that opened hull seams and caused flooding. On April 13th, another attack caused serious damage. The ship developed a 15-degree list to port. Flooding continued despite all efforts to control it. On April 14th, Emden was towed from the shipyard into Heikendorfer Bucht. The crew managed to seal the hull temporarily and stop additional flooding, but the damage was beyond repair. The ship was run aground in shallow water to prevent her sinking. On April 26, 1945, Emden was officially decommissioned. Her war pennant was struck. Her crew was reduced to a skeleton force responsible for security and demolition preparations. The orders were clear. No Kriegsmarine vessel would fall into Allied hands intact. Admiral Dönitz had issued Operation Regenbogen instructions. Every ship, every U-boat, every facility of military value would be destroyed before capture. The orders were controversial. Many officers argued that destroying the fleet served no purpose. The war was lost. Preserving ships for post-war reconstruction made more sense than scuttling them. But Dönitz insisted the Kriegsmarine would not surrender its ships. It would destroy them. On May 1, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. Dönitz became head of state. On May 2nd, 32 U-boats were scuttled at Travemünde. On May 3rd, Dönitz sent Generaloberst Hans-Georg von Friedeburg to Field Marshal Montgomery's headquarters at Lüneburg to negotiate surrender. Montgomery refused to negotiate anything except unconditional surrender of all German forces in northwest Europe. The discussions continued. While negotiations proceeded, the demolition of German naval assets continued. On May 3rd, 39 U-boats were scuttled at Kiel, 7 more at Hamburg, and Emden's crew prepared to destroy their ship. The explosives were in place. Charges in the magazines would detonate the remaining ammunition. Charges in the engine rooms would destroy the turbines and boilers. Charges in fuel bunkers would rupture tanks and ignite residual fuel. The charges were connected in series. One detonation would trigger the others. The ship would be destroyed thoroughly, making salvage impractical. The crew assembled at dawn. Some had served aboard Emden for years. They knew every compartment, every passage, every mechanical system. They had maintained the ship through training cruises and operational deployments. They had fought fires from bomb hits. They had repaired damage from groundings and near misses. Now they would destroy what they had spent years preserving. The decision was not debated. Orders were orders. The Kriegsmarine operated on discipline. Officers commanded. Crews obeyed. The concept of refusing orders, of questioning whether destroying the ship served any purpose, was alien to the culture. If orders required scuttling, the ship would be scuttled. Personal opinions were irrelevant. At the designated time, the charges detonated. The explosions were massive. Flame shot from hatches and ventilators. Smoke billowed across the harbor. The hull, already weakened by bomb damage, collapsed under the stress. The list increased. The ship settled deeper into the mud. When the smoke cleared, Emden was a wreck. The engines were destroyed. The hull was breached in multiple locations. The superstructure was collapsed. Salvage would be impractical. The mission was accomplished. 5 days later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe ended. Emden lay in Heikendorfer Bucht. A total loss. British occupation forces inspected the wreck. Salvage experts assessed the damage. Conclusion: not worth recovering. The wreck would be dismantled in place over several years. The process began in 1946 and continued through 1949. The hull was cut into sections underwater. Components were raised individually. Scrap metal was sold. By 1950, nothing remained except debris on the seabed. The bow ornament survived. The Iron Cross that had been mounted on Emden's bow in honor of the first Emden was recovered and preserved. It is currently displayed at the Deutsches Museum in Munich. This single artifact represents all that remains of the ship that trained a generation of German naval officers. The scuttling of Emden represented more than the destruction of one obsolete cruiser. It represented the end of the Kriegsmarine as an institution. The surface fleet had been effectively destroyed by 1943. The U-boat force was decimated by 1944. By May 1945, almost nothing operational remained. Emden was among the last surface units still afloat. Her destruction symbolized the final dissolution of German naval power. The discipline that characterized Emden's crew in those final days reflected Kriegsmarine culture. Orders were absolute. Personal survival, personal opinions, even common sense regarding the futility of further resistance were subordinate to orders. This discipline had sustained German naval operations through 6 years of war. It had enabled U-boat crews to continue missions when loss rates exceeded 50%. It had kept surface units operational in Norwegian fjords when every sortie risked destruction by overwhelming Allied air power. And it ensured that when orders required the destruction of the fleet, those orders would be executed. The alternative would have been surrender. Allow British forces to capture Emden intact. Provide intelligence on German naval technology. Training methods. Operational procedures. Preserve the ship for potential post-war use by occupation forces or Allied navies short of vessels. From a practical standpoint, surrender made sense. The war was over. Further destruction served no military purpose. But surrender was incompatible with institutional identity. The Kaiserliche Marine had scuttled the High Seas Fleet at Scapa Flow in June 1919 rather than allow seizure. That act was remembered as honorable defiance, preferable to the humiliation of watching German warships sail under enemy flags. The Kriegsmarine would do the same. The fleet would be destroyed by its own crews. Allied forces would capture nothing of value. This was institutional suicide, chosen deliberately over institutional surrender. Historians debate whether the scuttling was justified. Some argue it was fanaticism, pointless destruction serving no purpose except to satisfy concepts of honor that had become disconnected from reality. Others argue it was rational, denying intelligence and materiel to the enemy even in defeat, preserving institutional dignity, ensuring that German naval forces would not be used against Germany during occupation. The truth is probably simpler. The crews who scuttled their ships were following orders issued by legitimate authority. Dönitz commanded the Kriegsmarine. Hitler had designated him as successor. His orders were legal under German military law. The crews obeyed because obedience was their function. Philosophical debates about whether the orders were sensible were not their responsibility. For Emden specifically, the scuttling was anticlimactic. The ship was already destroyed by bomb damage. She was aground, listing, incapable of movement or combat. Demolition charges simply ensured she couldn't be salvaged. The Allied forces would have scrapped her anyway. The explosives merely accelerated that process. The symbolic significance exceeded the practical impact. But the symbolism mattered. Emden was the first major warship built in Germany after Versailles. She represented the rebuilding of German naval power. She trained the officers who commanded U-boats, cruisers, destroyers through the war. Every Kriegsmarine officer commissioned between 1925 and 1939 likely served aboard Emden at some point during cadet training. The ship was the institutional heart of the pre-war and wartime Navy. Her destruction marked the end of that institution. The legacy of Emden extends beyond the physical ship. She validated that German industry could build modern warships despite treaty restrictions. She demonstrated that long-range training cruises built seamanship and institutional culture. She proved that old ships could remain operational through constant maintenance and crew dedication. And she exemplified the discipline that characterized the Kriegsmarine through victory and defeat, success and failure, rational operations and futile resistance. The final act, the scuttling on May 3, 1945, was consistent with that legacy. Discipline required obedience. Orders required destruction. The crew executed those orders professionally. The ship was destroyed thoroughly. The mission was completed. That the mission served no strategic purpose and the war was already lost was irrelevant. Orders were orders. They would be obeyed until the final moment. That is the story of Emden, built to rebuild a navy, used to train officers, sent to war as an auxiliary, damaged repeatedly, evacuated civilians, carried a field marshal's body, bombed into a hulk, scuttled by her own crew, dismantled and forgotten. The ship is gone. The officers she trained are dead. The institution she represented is extinct. What remains is the record of 20 years' service, ending with one final act of discipline, the destruction of the ship to prevent her capture, executed precisely as ordered, 5 days before the surrender that made the destruction meaningless. That was the Kriegsmarine at the end. Professional, disciplined, obedient, futile,